So we're moving on to the fourth plenary session titled Innovation and Non-Price Effects in Merger Review. And I would like to pass the floor to the moderator of this session, Ms. Reiko Aoki, Commissioner of Japan Fair Trade Commission. If you please.
Thank you, Yamamoto-san. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is enjoying this workshop as well as their stay in Tokyo. And this is the first session of the day and also the last plenary session of this workshop. And we're going to handle two very exciting issues, innovation and non-price effects in merger review. And we'll be discussing issues such as how to consider innovation and non-price effects in merger review, and also challenges that us enforcers face when analyzing these effects. And for that, we have a very distinguished panel. Let me introduce them to you in the order that's listed here, which is different from the order they decided to sit down. So first, Mr. Carlos Esteva Mosso, is Deputy Director-General for Directorate-General for Mergers at the Competition Directorate-General of the European Commission. Previously, he was in charge of the Directorate for Policy and Strategy, and he held a number of management positions in DG Comp prior to that. And then we have Ms. Edith Ramirez. Edith is co-head of Hogan Lovells Global Antitrust Practice and a member of the firm's Privacy and Cybersecurity Practice Group. Prior to joining Hogan Lovells, she was chairwoman of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. And then we have Ms. Lebohang Mabidikane. Lebohang is head of the Mergers and Acquisition Division of the Competition Commission of South Africa, CCSA. She has worked at the CSSA for 9 years and have ample experience in merger investigations. And finally, Mr. Tom Leuner. Tom is General Manager of Merger Investigations at Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC. His branch handles the major merger reviews by the ACCC, and he has worked at the ACCC for 15 years, mostly in mergers, but also in energy market regulation. Now we will move on to the two topics in this section. First, innovation and merger review. We'll start with Edith. It is said that there are positive and negative effects of mergers on innovation. What do you think, and what effects do mergers have on innovation?
Thank you. First, let me say that I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. And in order to answer the question that the Commissioner posed, I'd like to start with some stage setting and talking about the theory and addressing first the question about what is the relationship between market structure and innovation. When we're talking about innovation, there isn't the consensus the general consensus that exists with regard to the relationship between concentration and short-term price effects. And so I think it's important to start on that broad theoretical level, and then I'll turn to describing general approach that is taken by the U.S. agencies in the U.S. to then lay the framework and set the stage for the subsequent discussion. So to address this question about this relationship between market concentration and innovation, I'll start off by referring to the influential Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, who highlighted and saw the importance of longer-term innovation impacts. For him, what mattered most was not price, but rather competition that comes from, using his words, the new commodity, the new technology, the new source of supply. And in his view, it was worth sacrificing short-term benefits that related to price in order to achieve longer-term benefits that could come from innovation. He believed that size and market power promoted innovation. The competing view is one held by the American economist Kenneth Arrow. And in his view, it was competition that encouraged innovation. And his core insight was that market power had the potential to lower incentives to innovate under particular circumstances. And in particular, he focused on the fact that profits can dampen the incentives for innovation in the situation where those profits, where innovation would end up displacing current and existing profits. So which of the two competing views is the right one? There is no consensus, and there continues to be a debate about that question. And what we can say is that the relationship between market structure, competition, and innovation is a complicated one, and one that is evolving. One key factor in the difference in conclusions that Schumpeter arrives at versus the conclusions that Arrow reaches relates to a firm's ability to appropriate the benefits of its research and development. Where appropriation is limited, meaning that firms have less of an ability to appropriate the rewards of its efforts to innovate, and where other firms have an easier ability to easily imitate a rival's innovations without compensating the inventor, in that situation, a merger does have the potential to increase the combined firm's ability to innovate. And it is that core situation that underlies the Schumpeter view. Where appropriation is stronger, that is the situation that underlies Arrow's view that market power can dampen the incentives to innovate. So let me translate that theoretical debate into a framework for how antitrust agencies approach this issue. And to do that, I'll turn to, and I'll focus on, in particular, the approach that's taken in the US. And in particular, I'd like to highlight the framework that's set out in the US agencies, the FTC and the Department of Justice, 2010 Horizontal Merger Guidelines. The guidelines that were in place prior to the 2010 guidelines, the 1992 guidelines, were often criticized because they, in the view of critics, placed too much of a focus on static efficiencies, on price competition, and really gave short shrift to the importance of dynamic efficiencies or longer-term innovation effects. Now, the agencies did, in fact, understand the importance of the longer-term benefits of innovation, but that hadn't been clearly set out in guidelines. And so one of the changes that the 2010 Horizontal Merger Guidelines made was to include a specific section that addressed innovation and non-price effects. Those guidelines highlighted that a merger had the potential to curtail innovation in two key ways. This curtailment could take the form of reduced incentives to continue with existing product development, or alternatively, it could also curtail incentives to initiate the development of new products. In the first scenario involving existing product development, this would be most likely to occur if one of the merging firms was engaging in current efforts to introduce new products that would capture revenues from the other merging firm. In the other situation involving the development of new products, the focus would be a longer run effect. And here, this would most likely occur if one of the merging firms has had the capability that would likely lead it to develop new products that could then in turn capture revenues from the other merging firm. So in that latter situation, the agencies would consider whether the merging firms are among a small group of firms that have the capability to engage in innovation. Of course, the challenge is that trying to ascertain the impacts of what will happen in the future can be quite challenging. There's an inherent uncertainty that comes with evaluating the success of research and development. It is also difficult to evaluate R&D capabilities. And then the longer term the projections are, that alone will create even more uncertainty. And so that creates a challenge not only for the agencies as they conduct their own evaluation of the impact that a merger may have on innovation benefits, but then also can have important implications for trying to establish before a decision maker, before a court for the agencies that have to prove their case in court. That then creates other obstacles that also inevitably play and factor into an agency's analysis. So I think with that just broad and high-level framework, we can then turn to a more concrete discussion about how this plays out.
Thank you, Edith, for a wonderful summary of the issues and putting us the discussion today in perspective. Thank you very much. And now, Carlos, I think you would like to, EU has actually had an experience putting what Edith put into perspective very recently in a very big case involving Dow DuPont. So could you give us some insight into how EU approached this case?
Well, good morning, and thanks really for the invitation and for this great hospitality. Let me start with a little history, little anecdote. 20 years ago, I was working for Mario Monti. You will remember he was a competition commissioner. He then became Prime Minister of Italy, and we traveled to Harvard University. We met with the business and economics faculty there, and we started to discuss merger enforcement. And at some point, Michael Porter popped in. You may remember also Michael Porter. He was this famous guru, business guru in the late 90s. He had written some influential books about competitive strategy. And he listened for a while, and then suddenly he stopped the conversation and said, guys, you are getting it all wrong. You are only focusing on short-term impacts of mergers. What really matters here is the medium and long-term impact on innovation. That's what has an impact on productivity. That's what has an impact on growth. And as a result of this debate, he ended up writing an article in the Antitrust Bulletin where he said merger control should focus on productivity, not on short-term impact on prices. That was 20 years ago. I think he had a point. Certainly, we still have a work to care about short-term impact on prices. We need to protect consumers, but we need to focus more and more in the impact on innovation and productivity of mergers. And the debate, I think, has shifted. We don't discuss whether we should do it any longer, but how to do it. And the experience of the European Commission is similar to the one Edith, at least the framework on which we assess this is similar to the one Edith described in the US guidelines. We also, when we look at competition impact or merger impact on innovation, we talk about two very different things. First, we looked at the impact of a merger on the elimination of pipeline products that may be competing against existing or pipeline products of the other merging party. This type of analysis is very similar to the analysis of potential competition. You would care about the elimination of a future product in the market, and therefore you would focus mostly on the impact that this may have on future impact on prices. But we also care more generally about the reduction of innovation or innovation activity. And there, the focus will not be so much on the elimination of a product that is about to reach the market, but on the elimination of innovation efforts that as a result of the merger could be diverted, could be redirected, or could be simply eliminating to avoid the cannibalization that two competing research projects may have on the revenues of the future merger entity. And here is where the recent experience in Dow DuPont, in Bayer Monsanto, a number of mergers in the agrochemical industry has been very relevant because has allowed us to go quite a lot in detail in analyzing these type of effects. Let me describe briefly what this industry looks like and what our analysis was about. This is a very concentrated industry. You have basically 5 global players with the capabilities to produce new active ingredients, which is the chemical compound that allow you to fight some pests. And this is an industry that has been consolidating over the years, where you see that the level of research and development has going down, where you see that new active ingredients are being produced at slower rates than in the past. And the first merger that we examined, Dow DuPont, would have created a market leader in this area. We looked at not only the market shares in current markets, but also at the capability of these two companies as innovators. And we realized that two of them, and in particular DuPont, had been much more successful as innovators in recent years than what their market shares would suggest. We look at this by looking at their past record in bringing new innovative products to the market. We did a serious analysis of their patent portfolio. But it's not only that they were good innovators, it's that they were quite close innovators. I said there were 5 major companies in this market, but not the 5 would investigate in the same areas. Companies decide every year where they want to allocate their research and development budgets, and we saw that in this industry you would focus on combination of some pests and some crops. For instance, you would focus on herbicides for cereals, or you would focus on fungicides for tomatoes, and you would invest your research and development budget on some of these, what we called in the decision, innovation areas. And we realized that in some of these areas, you did not have 5 players. You may have had 4 or 3. And therefore, the merger was not a 5-4, but very often in some markets it was a 4-3 or even a 3-2. Actually, for the crops that matter for European consumers, more than 80% of the products you had 4 players or less. And we realized that in some of these innovation areas, the two parties had invested particularly and were quite close competitors. This is something that competition authorities have the benefit of being able to know, because these projects are normally quite confidential. Companies will not reveal them, but we have the advantage of getting information from all different parties and being able to compare. And even in our decisions, you will not read always all the details because many of them are confidential. We know who is investigating where, and we can see who's close to whom. No? And on top of this, we got a lot of internal evidence, internal documents, about what were the plans of the parties post-merger. And there were very telling internal documents showing that they were ready to discontinue even one of the full research and development activities of one of the parties. And you could have wondered, is this an efficiency? At the end of the day, you will reduce costs. But actually, the internal evidence also shown that these parties were targeting less innovation than the one that was targeted by the 2 separate entities alone. They had a target, now inventing, of 2 active ingredients per year, and the combined merger would have, rather than 2 and 2, only a target of 3. Let's put it that way. No? Then when you have all this evidence together, I think an enforcer has to realize that there's a big risk that innovation in a pretty core market, the market that ensures that we have agricultural production for the future, could be affected. And that's why we intervene in this market. Maybe let me make a comment on the economic framework of all this. As Edith has said, economics have not been so helpful so far in this area. We've seen quite a lot of ambiguity in terms of what are the effects of mergers. And there is now a debate being launched in part by our colleagues in the chief economist team that in certain settings you can model that the impact of mergers on innovation will be negative. I'm saying very clearly in certain settings, that is in settings where you have few players, where they are closely related, they are close competitors, where IP rights are protected and therefore the appropriation mechanism plays less of a role. In this setting, economics could tell us that mergers could lead to a risk for innovation. Now, this is a debate that we welcome very much. Economists continue to discuss this, but it needs to be very clear. Our decision was not based on this model. Our decision is based exclusively on internal evidence from the parties. The model is very useful and it's consistent with the decision, and I hope in the future economists continue to debate and they come with some rules that we can apply, but for the moment, we are relying on internal evidence, and in this specific case, I think the internal evidence was very telling that this merger could have negatively affected innovation.
Thank you, Thank you, Carlos. That was very informative, including the comments about the economic role of economic models in that particular case. Now, back to you, Edith. As you noted in your presentation, the U.S. 2010 merger guidelines reference both short-term impact and long-term impacts of mergers on innovation. Can you tell us how the U.S. agencies have applied the guidelines and addressed the challenges of evaluating the impact on evaluating impact of mergers on innovation?
Sure. I'll give a couple of examples. I think it tracks very well what Carlos was describing. When one is discussing the issue of pipeline products, I think there is a very well-developed path and a lot of experience by the U.S. agencies in terms of how to handle those types of situations. It comes up, of course, very frequently in the pharmaceutical arena, medical device arena. And there's a lot of experience in tackling those issues. I think things can get a little bit murkier once you fall outside of those situations where there are very clear pipeline pathways. Let me highlight one particular case that highlights a challenge that I alluded to in my earlier comments, and that is the challenge of establishing that entry would have occurred in a situation involving what is referred to as potential competition, a situation where you're looking at the shorter to midterm impact of existing development of a product, and that is the Steris synergy case, that the challenge that the FTC brought in 2015. That particular case involved a merger between Steris Corporation and Synergy Health. There, the FTC alleged that the combination would have the result of ending Synergy Health's plans to enter the U.S. Market, bringing into the market a new X-ray sterilization technology. And that challenge ended up being litigated, and the FTC was not able to persuade the district court that that Synergy would have introduced that product in the absence of the acquisition. And so there, not only do the agencies have a challenge in evaluating whether or not a particular product would likely enter the market, but again, if you're faced with having to go to court and prove to a decision maker, it's possible that the evidence might be seen to be too murky to show that in fact there was indeed a likelihood of entry. And in that situation, the court denied a motion for preliminary injunction, and the merger was allowed to move forward. So that, again, just highlights some of the challenges that I think agencies face. Sticking to this issue of innovation, when it comes to existing product development, I want to note one impact on the remedy side of things. In the pharmaceutical arena, earlier this year, the director of the Bureau of Competition of the FTC noted, acknowledging some of the challenges that one faces when it comes to the uncertainty of success of potential products. He noted that when it comes to divestitures, when you have a combination of a firm and one of the firms is in fact developing, has a pipeline product, he noted that in particular areas, and he highlighted the inhalable and injectable drug market in particular, that there the uncertainties were such that they created a concern about that potential competition, potential future competition, but that the uncertainty meant that a remedy, the FTC would only accept a remedy where the existing product would be divested. In other words, they would not agree to a divestiture of the pipeline product because the agency did not want the public to bear the uncertainty of that pipeline product, and rather that the merging parties would have to bear that particular risk. So I think that the issue of innovation can also impact the remedies that an agency may agree to. I'll just make I'll reference one particular case that DOJ brought, and that was a challenge to the Halliburton Baker Hughes merger that focused on the longer term issue of R&D capability. In that particular case, among other concerns about competition, the DOJ noted that that particular combination would have resulted in combining two of the three biggest players who were best positioned to innovate, and therefore that was just an additional reason for seeking to block that particular merger. And that, again, just focuses on the longer term impacts that a merger may have. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Plenty of examples to think through the difficulty of the trade-offs in an innovation. And Edith mentioned remedy. And back to you, Carlos. I think that DuPont also included some remedies, and perhaps you could comment on that, and also remedies in general, once that the harm to innovation has been identified in a merger case.
Yes, well, a remedy is always an artificial intervention in the economy, which presents a number of risks, and this is even more acute in the area of research and development, because what you want is to ensure that an activity with a lot of intangibles is transferred in a way that doesn't harm the innovation activity that is conducted there. That's why in this area we've been particularly risk averse. We don't want that the customers, as Edith was saying, bears the risk of a remedy, but rather the merging parties should. And we have asked normally for a very structural divestitures. In Dow DuPont in particular, one of the full research and development activities of the parties was divested, and that means the full activity, including the research facility, including IP rights, including models, including products in development, and obviously all the scientists and employees of the activity. And the same thing was done in Bayer Monsanto, by the way. It's important in these situations to limit the risks, and that's to limit the carve-outs. In our case, it was even a reverse carve-out. The full facility was divested, and the parties were allowed to retain small bits of it in areas where there were no innovation concerns, but the mass of the facility was divested. It's also important to ensure that there are no issues of mix and match, that is, that what is divested as a research and development facility coincides with the divestitures that you have on the product side, and not different products and different research. And it's very important also to identify the right buyer. In most of these cases, we had an upfront buyer requirement, that is, the merger could not be closed until the Commission would have identified a buyer that had the capabilities to run these efficiently. And actually, both in the case of Dow DuPont, in the case of Bayer Monsanto, we have identified buyers that were already present in the industry, but not yet at the level of the five major players. But maybe one broader reflection. I think innovation capabilities are necessary not only on cases where we identify innovation concerns, also in cases where we would identify simply a short-term price impact. What you want to be divested is a sustainable business that will continue to grow in the future. You don't want in your remedy that they simply divest a product, and once the life cycle of this product is over, the remedy disappears. You want a business to be divested that will continue to develop in the future. Then even for normal cases where you have an impact on prices as the main theory of harm, we tend to request that some innovation capabilities are attached to it. That the research and development people linked to that product are transferred, and the capabilities to develop these products for the future are transferred. This is, I think, what you want to do if your remedy is going to be a long-lasting solution to the competition concerns.
Thank you, Carlos. I personally have great interest in this topic, so I'm running over time. So, but I would like to hear from Tom about smaller jurisdictions, what challenges you face about analyzing effective innovation from a merger, particularly being from a jurisdiction with voluntary notification and non-compulsory upfront information requirements.
Thank you, and thank you to the JFTC for hosting this wonderful event. I think the challenge for a small jurisdiction, and it's a common challenge to many merger reviews where there's global issues, that innovation is so often very much globally driven. All the information relevant is going to be overseas. So it's tricky for a small jurisdiction to know what to do, because we're just as concerned about innovation as the big jurisdictions, but I've got a limited pool of resources. So it brings into question this issue that I've heard raised at ICN meetings before of deference. And that is, should a small jurisdiction sort of defer to the large jurisdictions? Now, at the ACCC, we really hate that word deference, because I think it sort of implies that we're not independently making our own decision, which is not right. But perhaps there's an element of which we follow the timing of the large jurisdictions, we learn from their analysis and take their lead on some of the work. And I think, innovation is just a classic example of where we're very reliant, I think, on those larger jurisdictions, so that I can dedicate my teams to the Australian-specific issues arising, that are coming up from mergers where there's particularly an Australian business operation or something like that.
Thank you, Tom, for making very concise comments. And now back to you again, Tom. We'll move on to the next topic, non-price effective mergers. So would you like to start off a discussion about challenges in assessing non-price effects of mergers?
Yes, so I've been asked to talk about non-price effects excluding innovation. So what are we talking about here? I think it's things like the quality, the service levels, the reliability, the branding, product support, wait time at a retail store, the extent to which the product is customised for the customer, all these aspects other than price. And I asked my chief economist at home, what should I say? And his answer was, non-price effects are ubiquitous and they're as important as price effects. And I think, the more I thought about it, I thought that, well, that's definitely true. And as our economies become more complex, it's less and less likely that we're going to be looking at mergers involving sort of homogenous goods where there's just a standard price analysis. Our economies, there's just going to be less mergers in those spaces because there are less of those kind of products. And indeed, as we all know, in some merger reviews, there is no price at all, media mergers and online mergers, where the customer isn't sort of paying an explicit price. Now, obviously, you can look at the flip side of these two-sided markets, and you could look at the price of advertising, but it's important that we also consider impacts on consumers, not just the advertisers. And just this morning, Australia announced, or the ACCC announced its clearance of a big newspaper TV merger, so a big TV station combining with a big newspaper. And throughout that entire review, we hardly thought about price at all. Advertising wasn't really an issue. It wasn't about the price of the newspapers. All the analysis was about the level of journalistic effort, which was sort of code for, non-price effects. We tried to avoid the use of the word quality because it's so subjective. I might think certain newspapers high quality and other people think it's terrible, and vice versa. So we sort of talked about level of journalistic effort, and we even looked at how many journalists are being employed by all these different media organisations in Australia. That was a really critical issue in that matter. Now, despite this prevalence of non-price effects and its growing importance, most of our sort of standard tests in antitrust law or competition law, they're based on price. The SNP test, the hypothetical monopolist test, critical loss analysis, and most sort of merger simulations or merger modelling. If you talk to the economists, it's all based on price data. So I think we end up with a little bit of a dilemma there. Now, I know you can sort of say, well, it's the quality adjusted price, and you can think about, well, rather than a 5% increase in price under the SNP test, you can say it's a 5% decrease in quality. But as we all know, the problem there is there's the data, and the economists will crave this data, but they just won't get it because these are subjective issues, these quality assessments. You may get some data sets. For example, if you look at a retail merger, you may be able to look at the average wait time at the checkout, or you can do a survey of consumers and try and assess some aspect of the non-price issues, but it's only going to be one aspect rather than the whole, all-encompassing non-price issues, which are going to be much more complicated, and you just can't measure them. So what does this mean where we're lacking this data for non-price effects? And I think, at least in Australia, we're thinking it pushes us more towards a qualitative assessment and less quantitative assessment. And in terms of our day-to-day investigations, I think this means more focus on the documents of the merger parties and forcing documents out of the merger parties via formal requests. I think it means more engagement with the consumers, probably than might otherwise be the case, and we're really relying on what those consumers are saying about the impact of competition. And more use of things like deposing the company executives or having formal interviews to really push them to reveal the information that's required to make those assessments. Now, I just thought I'd wind up with one little case study, which I thought was quite a neat example of non-price effects being a critical issue in a merger matter. And it involved after-school care. And I'm not sure if this is a thing around the world, but in Australia, a lot of parents leave their children at the school after, at 3:30, and they go and pick up their kids at 6 p.m. because they're working. And there are these big companies that actually offer that service. So they go into the school and they run this little after-school program at the school. And it was a merger of the two biggest players in this industry. And it's not an industry I'd ever thought about before, and I don't think there was any international precedence. But the more we looked at it, we found that there was no price competition, really. I mean, there was perhaps a little bit. And the reason is because it's a subsidised service, and if you sort of pushed your price below or above the subsidy level, it changed the economic returns you got. So they tended to compete in terms of quality and all these other things, like the number of carers per child, whether the kids got fresh food or junk food for their snack, did they have educational programs as part of the after-school thing? And we also found that the regulators encouraged this type of competition because of these state-based regulators, and they would be like, company X is, got one staff member per 10 kids, and company Y's got one staff member per 12 kids, and they would sort of point this out and force them to try and meet the best level of quality. And there was, in the whole assessment, there was very little focus on price at all. Now, we had significant concerns with that merger, but unfortunately the parties withdrew before we made a final decision, so we didn't make a final call on that one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. And now, Lebohang, what is the challenges in assessing non-price effects of mergers, and how do you do with those challenges in your jurisdiction?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you to our hosts, and we really are honored to be here. So I want to start off with a disclaimer. I am not an economist, I'm a lawyer. So if any economists in the room want to take issue with our approach, I'm unlikely to answer convincingly to your queries. My colleague is also a lawyer, so we've left the backup at home. All the economists stayed behind and have left us exposed, essentially. But I think the first thing that's... Yes, my slides are up. So just by way of introduction, I think what's important is to understand the history of the South African economy and our markets. This will assist us to understand the approach that we've been taking whenever we've been presented with non-price effects in specific mergers. So as some of you may know, South Africa was really run by an apartheid regime prior to 1994. And that regime essentially had sanctions against it, and it left the majority of the wealth of the country in the hands of the minority, and that really resulted in a market, or rather an economy that's characterized by high levels of concentration in the different sectors, and as well as oligopolistic players, monopolistic players, some of which were in fact state-owned and still prevail to this day. So, with the democratic government coming into force in 1994, we really started seeing, it was really the first time where we started seeing markets which function naturally as markets should. So with no sanctions in place, you found the stimulation of entry of international firms now participating in the South African market, as well as some upcoming local players. So when we talk of non-pricing effects in mergers, really from a South African point of view, we are talking about innovation as well as quality of service. I will try not to spend time on innovation. I think we've had a lot of discussions regarding innovation. And as you will see from some of the cases I'm going to sample, we've really been spending a lot of time on the issue of quality of service. So you would see from the discussions from yesterday, one typically experiences non-price effects in your very progressive, disruptive markets, your digital markets. But our experience has really shown that you can actually engage with non-price effects in your very traditional markets, which aren't really innovative markets, which aren't digital markets. You'll see from the cases, we've actually grappled with these issues in the private hospital care industry. We've also grappled with these issues in the supply of mining outputs, and I will speak to the specifics of each case as I go along. But what we certainly will say is that for our approach generally is that you still have a pricing effects analysis as your primary approach, and then the non-price effects have basically become incidental to the pricing approach, and I will explain exactly how when I talk to the cases. So we, over the past this was in the past financial year, we've had about 3 mergers in the private hospital care market. You'll see the first one is Netcare. It involves the Netcare and the Lakeview Hospital, Netcare and Akiso, as well as Mediclinic and Akiso. Mediclinic and Matlosana, rather. And some of you may know that in South Africa, in the South African private healthcare space, there's really about 3 players who dominate the market. It's Netcare, Mediclinic, as well as Life. So the 2 acquirers in the 3 cases would be having quite a dominant position in the market. And essentially, the cases involve the acquisition of smaller private hospitals by these dominant players. what we found, and of course, the private healthcare space, at least in South Africa, is also your two-sided market where you've got the private hospital service provider working with a medical insurance scheme, who would be the one who would negotiate on an annual basis the tariffs which are applicable for specific medical procedures. And then on the other hand, you'll have the end user, so to speak, which is the patient who will eventually be admitted in that hospital and have some or other medical procedure performed. What's always interesting, of course, with medical cases is that the price competition is very limited because, as I said, you're talking about medical insurance schemes who negotiate pricing tariffs once a year annually, and it's also a regulated space. So they obviously can't, the hospitals can't command whatever price they would want, but you've got that discussion, which then, once it's concluded, the customer, being the end user or the patient, will never really have a debate about how much healthcare will cost them, because they rely on the medical insurance benefit to pay for that cost. So, but I think what's also important is that the patient then wields the power to decide who will use what service at what particular time. And this is where non-pricing effects come into play, because it is the customer, or rather the patient, who's going to decide whether they're going to use a life or a mediclinic or a net care facility, and they consider factors such as the quality of service, the most modern technology, medical technology, whether the machine has got the most advanced CAT scan, whether the hospital has got the most advanced CAT scan machine, for that matter, and of course issues surrounding the expertise of the medical staff, the friendliness of the nurses as well. In South Africa, this is quite topical because in the public health space, the nurses are known to be a little bit unfriendly. So in the so in a South African patient's mind, believe you me, that's very important. It's not as trivial as it may sound. But yeah, so essentially those are the aspects of non-price competition that we have seen in the private hospital care space. And then, when you look at the industrial sectors, we refer there to a case called Emers and the Andalusite case. This is the one that took place so Andalusite is a mineral basically that's used in refectories for the control of temperature. And what happened in this merger is that you were basically having just two suppliers in the market for the product. And so we got to basically look at what this means over and above the preliminary inquiry about the pricing. So when you're running your unilateral effects assessment, looking at whether indeed there would be an increase in price, you basically get to see what the market looked like before. And what we gleaned was that customers in this space are very interested in quality. The customers were telling us that as far as they're concerned, it's also important that the quality of the fineness of the granular fineness of the Andalusite was important in the mind of the customer when making a decision as to which or one of the merging parties to purchase from. And then the next case was the Graef and Ream case, which is currently under reconsideration in our tribunal, as some of you may know. It was an intermediate merger, so we prohibited this merger. And interestingly, with this transaction is that it was not the first time we prohibited the transaction. So the parties notified in 2004, and we investigated and finalized on a prohibition in 2004. And so some years later, about 5 years later or so, they came last year and they notified again. And obviously the argument was that the market has changed and, all these wonderful things that merging parties will always allege to try and get a transaction to go through. But what we saw was the exact same market, no entry in the past 4 years, two players still, it was reliving the 2004 investigation because the issues were exactly the same. And I think I pause here to mention that maybe the thinking around why it would be important for a regulator to look into non-price effects in a situation like the Greif and Riem situation. When parties, merging parties, when they are prepped by practitioners, you almost anticipate the competition analysis. And so, what we're seeing a lot in our jurisdiction is parties saying, "Oh, by the way, I've just filed yesterday, and I've got a remedy for you." So they offer a remedy in advance because they sort of know what the problems are going to be. And again, as I say, it was a rehashing of an analysis which took place in 2004. And so you have parties saying, well, we are offering you a pricing remedy, so we know that you're worried about unilateral effects, so we want to allay your fears, and we're going to keep the price the same for the next 5 years. Now, our approach has always been that you would want to find a clean break, right? A clean structural solution to structural problems. If a merger presents a structural problem which is going to perpetuate forever, you can't really cure that with a pricing condition. And one knows that pricing conditions, they must be for a defined period. Whether it's 5 or 10 years, it depends on the negotiations. But the bottom line is competition regulators shouldn't want to be price regulators. That is not what we should be looking to do. And secondly, the issue of monitoring compliance with remedies is quite a burden on its own, on resources. And you can imagine if you're monitoring a 10-year pricing remedy, I'm not sure if your data set as well that you used when you started would still be reliable. There's just so many challenges that come with that type of approach. So essentially, this led us in the Greif matter to probe a bit more to try and sort of fend off the remedy that was so kindly offered by the merging parties. And of course, what we got to glean from the investigation was that customers in this market were looking for a little bit more indeed than price. The customers told us that, well, there's two issues. We are interested in quality, and we've always been able to assess quality from both players and make an independent determination for ourselves as to how much we want to acquire or whether at all we want to deal with the other party. But I think what was also interesting for us was the fact that customers were worried about security of supply. So the customers were saying, if this merger goes through, what will happen is that we can no longer mitigate our risk by using two suppliers. And I think more and more we are seeing markets in South Africa where customers are saying that in our line of business you just can't afford to use one supplier, and so it makes sense for you to rely on more than one. And so you shouldn't worry competition authorities about whether or not there will be foreclosure or anything like that, because we don't favor necessarily one supplier over the other. So needless to say, we prohibited the merger, and as I said, we are now in the competition tribunal, and we will see how that process goes. So maybe let me just turn to my next slide. So just speaking to the challenges with that background in mind, so that in our jurisdiction we have some statutorily imposed timelines, and a classic example again, and where we would have felt the pressure of these timelines, is the Greif matter, because for an intermediate merger, you've only got 60 days. And really, I'm sure we all appreciate 60 days in a complex transaction. It really feels like a lot less, and it just goes by very quickly. And I think merging parties, whenever you raise certain concerns, they've got the incentive to just drag their feet. You ask for information, they'll take 20 days, and that's 20 days off your 60 days. And essentially, you have to take a very conservative view in the end, because there isn't enough time in the statutory timelines to, leave no stone unturned, so to speak. So a lot of the issues I've related to, we've been exposed to them through the tribunal processes, where we are now on appeal, and because it's an appeal, you've got a little bit longer, and you've got the discovery process where you are able to ask for more information over and above what you may have had during your initial investigation. So, of course, you've got challenges such as the omission of factors regarding non-price competition by the merging parties. Again, this talks to the fact that merging parties have no incentive to help you as a regulator to get to the right answer. So that's why it's important for us to always be quite prudent in whatever we do. And then there's the issue of soliciting informative responses from customers of the merging parties. I think it's important to just pause here, because it's quite important. All of us have been talking about, getting feedback from customers, but I think what has proven to be helpful for us and what we've learned is that it's the manner of approach in getting answers from your customers that's going to get you somewhere. And this played itself out in this merger, because customers typically don't have non-pricing effects in their minds when you're busy with the investigation. So, it's almost like a human reaction. They are more obsessed about the fact that they're going to be paying like $1 more tomorrow for the same product, or R1 more, rather than innovation. And, of course, I say that quite measured in this, because markets are not the same. But certainly what we've seen in these cases, that, customers were more worried about prices. And it's only when the regulator starts to probe and say, what other issues weigh on your mind when you have to make the decision? Do you look at quality? And they suddenly remember, like, yes, of course, quality is important. And then you have to probe how important is it on a scale of 1 to 5 compared to pricing? Where would you rate it? And you find that, in fact, it's a lot more important than pricing in the end, as we actually found in these transactions that I've just alluded to. So I'll just pause on that legal instruments one, because I will address it in my concluding remarks. So a question is asked about what tools we require, or what more tools we require in assessing non-price competition. We've said there were detailed information responses from customers. I've just spoken to that and how you achieve that. As well as internal strategic documents of the merging parties. I will have a chance, I think, once I'm done with the formal presentation, to just speak a little bit more about what we have gleaned practically using a case example, and how that has assisted us in determining non-price effects. And of course, we have relied on independent reports on the dynamics of the specific markets. So maybe just on that first point, the issue the last point on this slide, the issue of legal instruments should not be seen as though we don't have a framework which allows us to ask for documents. I think there's a nuance in the sense that what our rules and our forms require is, strategic documents as they relate to the transaction, not necessarily all these other strategic documents, which we now know are not necessarily directly related to the merger, but will in any event be quite useful in terms of determining non-pricing effects. So what this is an older case, the Pioneer Pana case. I think it's at least 5 years or so. This was a merger in the seed market as well. And essentially what we got to glean from there was that at the time we advanced the issue of non-pricing effects, but our Competition Appeals Court actually did not hear us and they dismissed us. But in an ex post review, we've actually found that we would have been better placed to consider this 5 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Lebohang, for a very comprehensive presentation. And I think you answered a lot of the questions I was going to ask. Yeah. And in interest of saving time, I'd like to just finish the session by going back to Edith and have ask if there's anything that we have discussed today that would apply to digital markets in particular, since you're in the committee in your law office on digital
Yeah,
markets.
I think Tom alluded to a lot of this, and I think the main point is that in a lot of digital markets, when one is confronted with products in particular that are free, it does force us all to confront in a more direct manner the non-price impacts. I think I'll make one observation, a comment that I can now make now that I'm outside of the government. That pertains to all of the issues that we've been discussing today, both the issue of innovation and quality and other non-price effects. It is important, I think, in my view, for antitrust officials to really communicate how they're approaching these issues once you get outside the traditional space of looking at price effects, in order to communicate in the murkier areas when one is looking in particular at the longer term impacts. I think it is quite helpful to the business community to demonstrate and articulate how these issues are being approached. So I think I'll end on that note.
Thank you very much. So we'll finish with that forward-looking comment by Edith, and I apologize for very bad timekeeping on my part. Please join me in thanking the very distinguished panel for sharing their experience and insights with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all of your participation.